Today I'm going to be doing a review of a recent informal debate that took place between Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor on the question, is religion good or bad for society? Before I do that, though, here's a question that needs no debate. Is subscribing good or bad for this channel? Easy, it's very good. It helps you keep up with our content, and it helps us continue to share the faith online.
You heard the man, everyone. Subscribe, comment, spread the word. And share Trent's video. He's a nice guy. Hey 2024, welcome back to another video. As I promised, this is part 2 of analyzing the debate between Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro, except we're now looking at Trent Horn's take on it. If you don't know Trent Horn, he's a Christian apologist who I'm quite fond of, which may sound weird coming from an atheist, but I have to say I like his demeanor in debates and the fact that he always seems to address the opponent's point rather than reframe, build strawmen, and use red herrings as most Christian apologists I've seen. That aside, he's clearly not impervious to reasoning fallacies, and we'll look at some of those today. Trent Horn's video is separated into sections based on his talking points, so I'll do the same here for a clearer structure.
The topic is an interesting one. Is religion good or bad for society? That's actually a question that could be debated by two atheists, because the question does not assume anything about the truth of religion. Religion could be false and still be good for society. There's even a 2009 book that defends this thesis. It's called An Atheist Defends Religion: Why Humanity is Better Off with Religion Than Without It, by Bruce Shaman. Shapiro does a good job throughout the debate of pointing out that he's not trying to argue that God exists or that a certain religion is true. Instead, he's just arguing that certain things that are good for society, like truth, morality, and most importantly, free will, do not make sense without some kind of religious belief to ground those things.
Okay, Trent, but let's analyze a bit what you're saying. You claim that a religion doesn't need to be true to be socially useful, and I completely agree with that. Furthermore, I would argue that no religion has been proven to be true to date, yet that didn't change the fact that so many religions have shaped so many societies throughout history. But how is that possible? The answer is simple, because people believe them to be true. People don't function based on what's actually true, but based on what they believe to be true, which is to say, people cannot follow your God-imbued moral precepts if they don't believe they're coming from God. Or, even worse, they don't even believe God exists. And while you don't think you're required to prove that your God exists and that your religion is true, you need to, at the very least, convince people of that. And if your argument is, well, I don't need to prove that my religion is true, I only need to show that following my religious moral precepts has positive effects on the individual and society as a whole, that's fine. But then you're not arguing for God and religion, you're actually arguing for those specific moral precepts by virtue of assessing their societal effects, which means that this argument excludes the need for God and instead proposes a utility-based moral system, sort of like what Ben did in that debate. And if your overarching point is that you use the idea of God and religion to convince people to follow this utility-based moral system when they otherwise wouldn't, this gets us back to convincing people that your religion is true and that God exists. You cannot escape this point.
And Ben was very clear in saying that all he is arguing is that if you believe in free will, regardless of whether or not free will even exists. If you believe in free will, then you need religion to ground that belief, because you can't have free will in a materialistic universe where we're just atoms in motion.
I guess I'm confused about this point, but I don't get what Trent is implying here. I know Ben pointed out the same thing, but neither Ben nor Trent have expanded on the subject, and I'm confused for two reasons. The first one is the part with you can't have free will in a materialist universe where we are just atoms in motion. This reads to me as, we can't just be atoms in motion because that won't make sense. There has to be more to it than that. In essence, a big argument for personal incredulity. And I pair this with the semantical reframing of, oh, humans are just blobs of atoms and matter, without religion all you're left with is nihilism. Which, with all due respect, is a stupid point because it implies that all atheists are necessarily nihilists, which isn't true. Yes, we are blobs of matter, but we're also thinking agents who interact with one another, can reason, and experience a multitude of emotions and experiences. So we conduct our lives based on those facts, not based on we're just blobs of matter. The second reason for my confusion is the statement that you can only have free will if God exists, or to be more accurate, if you believe in God. I don't see how that follows, because as far as we can tell, our thoughts and drives inform our actions, and we cannot control our thoughts and drives. So it doesn't matter whether God exists or not, the reality is that we're still driven by our thoughts and drives. How does God existing suddenly changes that? Maybe Trent sees this video and cares to elaborate?
And this is the argument that hasn't yet been rebutted, that society does require an extraordinary number of people to believe that they are capable of making decisions for the good or for the bad.
And this was a good move by Ben because Alex basically agreed with him that, yeah, if atheism is true, you don't have free will. Alex is not a compatibilist. He's a hard determinist who would say free will is an illusion. Now, Alex tries to soften the blow by saying he lives life just fine without free will.
I hear this all the time. People say, look, you may say there's no free will, but you don't act as though that's the case. I suppose that I'm just confused as to what it would look like for somebody to act as if they believe there was no free will. I mean, the very argument that there is no free will that I subscribe to, at least one of the various forms that it takes, is a sort of Schopenhauerian view that you can do as you will, you just can't will what you will. The very mechanism that I think is responsible for eliminating the possibility of free will, that is, the drives that make people do what they do, like I say, do exactly that. Make people do what they do. They make them get out of bed in the morning.
But Ben pointed out that that might work for a highly educated individual like Alex O'Connor. But what happens when lots of regular people start to doubt that they have free will? So that's why the Israeli philosopher Saul Smilansky wrote the following in his book, Free Will and Delusion. To put it bluntly, people as a rule ought not to be fully aware of the ultimate inevitability of what they have done, for this will affect the way in which they hold themselves responsible. So in other words, Smilansky is saying that even if free will does not exist, in order to have society run well, people need to believe in free will.
Okay, I need to get this out of the way first.
If atheism is true,
atheism is not a statement, so it cannot be true or false. Atheism is the lack of belief in a God. It's not the statement that God does not exist, so you cannot attach true or false tags to it. You should be above this trend, come on. Second, it seems like Ben's and yours entire point is that we need people to believe in free will. Not that free will actually exists, because these are two different things. To put it simply, Alex claims that free will does not exist, and the evidence for that is the fact that when digging for the underlying cause, our instinctual, undetermined drives appear to be the end of the line. We can't go back farther than that. And because we cannot control our drives, we just act on them, the obvious conclusion is that there is no free will. We only have the illusion of free will. And Ben's comeback, and the one you're also subscribing to, is, yeah, but people need to believe that they have free will. Except this isn't a rebuttal of Alex's point, rather it's a tacit admission followed by a but. Something like, yeah, we don't have free will, but people need to believe they do. I mean, you even quote Smilansky here, who literally says the same thing, that people should not be aware of the ultimate inevitability of their actions. So I haven't seen an actual rebuttal to Alex's point that we don't have free will, which is why I don't understand why you think Ben did a good move there. He did a good move by not addressing Alex's point and discussing something else?
But if free will does not exist because atheism is true, if you don't have religion to ground free will, then you have these other social problems that are going to arise.
This statement right here implies the idea that you can only believe in free will if you're religious and believe in God. You cannot possibly have a coherent understanding of free will as an atheist. Here's one of the most famous atheists alive disagreeing with this point.
The way you describe consciousness is what I would probably call our agency.
Okay.
And while I don't think that we have libertarian free will, I'm on record as being a compatibilist along with Dan Dennett. But I also had another discussion recently, so I'm going to clarify it because of that discussion. I'm fine with the idea that we have a will, that we have desires, that we are an agent that is also capable of self-reflection to see what are the consequences of my action moving forward. To me, it does not matter if that is ultimately deterministic like clockwork, or if there was something that could trump determinism. That doesn't change to me the fact that you would be the agent responsible for your actions. Now, when my lawnmower acts up, I will sometimes anthropomorphically, cuss it out. But at the end, I recognize that the lawnmower is not a thinking agent, that is not making decisions. And so that difference between there is where I would inject the sort of ideas about moral responsibility. Sam Harris and I had an argument in Chicago about free will, and I was pointing out that he could walk over and step off the end of the stage, or I could pick him up and carry him and drop him off the stage, and at the end, the effect would essentially be the same. But the conflict between those two is everything that I describe as will, whether you want to call it free or not. I think that's what we value. That's what we care about. I would be responsible for that action. I would be acting in opposition to what the other agent wanted.
Well, under most notions of free will, most libertarian notions of free will, the idea that you could do otherwise in ways that might violate natural law, I don't think we have free will either. But I do think that we have something that's worth calling free will, partly because it's something that we care about. And so the easiest way I can describe what I'm talking about, which doesn't violate the physical laws of the universe and doesn't appeal to anything magical, is Don, could get up and walk out of the room right now, or I could drag Don out of the room when he doesn't want to leave. The difference between those two scenarios, even though in both of them he ends up out of the room, but the difference between those two is what we're going to call free will. This doesn't mean that you could have violated the natural order or anything like that. It is a way of recognizing that there are thinking agents who interact, and that you have this meat sack that I am has some desires, and those can come in conflict with others. And under that model, then we can hold me responsible for dragging Don out, or hold Don responsible for walking himself out. And that's primarily what we care about when we talk about free will.
I'm a compatibilist along with Dennett in the sense that if we define free will in a particular way, which is the freest will worth wanting, which is why I'm in agreement with Dennett's book, Elbow Room, which is the varieties of free will worth wanting, then we have the freest will we could imagine or need or want. That said, I generally prefer now to say that we have will. Whether or not it's free or how free it is, I have no idea. And so I don't need to come up with an explanation for something that hasn't been demonstrated to actually be real. Until somebody demonstrates that we actually have free will, I don't know why you would need an explanation for it. And so my take on this, which has changed some over the years, is we don't have a full-on explanation for consciousness, and neither does anybody else. It's not like, oh, if science can't explain something, therefore, when that doesn't happen, therefore we're justified in accepting some religion's proclamation about free will or determinism. That is never the case.
So you see, the difference really lies in how you define free will. And even if you define it the way Alex does, you can still say, okay, we don't have free will in that sense, because it appears to be deterministic, but we still need to hold people responsible for their actions. To do that, we will ignore that definition of free will because it's not pragmatic and useful, and instead treat people as agents responsible for their own actions. And as I've shown, or rather Matt Dillahunty showed it for me, you don't need religion to reach that conclusion. As a plus note, I find it interesting that Trent claims you cannot have a meaningful and useful definition of free will without religion, yet here is Matt providing us with one in great detail, including with examples. Yet neither Trent nor Ben can do the same for their religious free will. They simply claim it exists because God, but don't actually explain the mechanism. Very interesting indeed.
Remember, originally, Alex's argument was some variant of this. Religion leads to bad answers on questions like slavery, and slavery is bad for society, so therefore religion is bad for society.
Okay, Trent, so at this point I have three options at my disposal. You haven't actually seen the debate. You have seen the debate but didn't understand Alex's point. You have seen the debate and understood Alex's point, but you're simply lying about it. Which is it? For reference, here was Alex's main point when explaining why he thinks religion is bad for society.
if you have a human morality that recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on a planet, then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God, there's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community, but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me, because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe. Therefore, if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system in the dictates, allegedly, of the creator of the universe is all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults of nihilism and human invented morality, with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
Right, so religion is bad not because it sometimes leads to bad answers, but because it gives people the delusion of ultimate authority, which is to say that they believe their bad answers come from God and your word is nothing against the word of God. His point had nothing to do with slavery or the Bible, so I don't know why you would frame it like that.
But somewhere along the way, Alex's argument turned into this. Why would God allow the Bible to have a less than perfect set of rules regarding an issue like slavery? Notice that this question is implicitly endorsing an argument, and it would be an argument against the God of the Bible. If Yahweh existed, he would not allow slavery to be in the Bible, even if it was regulated in a way that was superior to surrounding cultures. If Yahweh existed, the Bible would have our modern understanding of slavery. The Bible does not have a modern ethical view related to slavery, therefore Yahweh doesn't exist. Alex's argument eventually drifted into this territory.
This wasn't Alex's point either.
Even if this was a liberalizing force, and even if this was not as bad as other slavery, do you think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes.
So how do you account for God commanding something which you now see to be, or rather permitting something and explicitly and giving you details about how to do something which is proactively immoral?
Because he's not permitting me, permitting my great to
do something immoral.
To do something
immoral.
That in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered immoral,
right.
But was it immoral? Now,
by today's standards that were developed by the
relativist?
Judeo-Christian tradition, sure. By today's standards developed under the Judeo-Christian tradition, immoral.
So
which, by the way, you're living off the you're again, not to get back to the Tom Holland argument, you're living off the remains of this. I mean, where's your morality coming from?
But who's the moral relativist now? I mean, it seems that a moment ago you say that the great success of religion is providing a sort of untouchable moral basis that sort of transcends human affairs and human debates. And now when I say, well, look at this, open your own religious scripture and look at this blatant immorality, you say, yeah, but well, that was considered to be fine at the time. It's considered to be bad now by the progress of Judeo-Christian
there's a question
values. Who's the moral relativist?
Well,
So Alex was attacking Ben's self-proclaimed absolute and universal moral system rather than God's very existence. Alex's point of contention was that Ben seemed to contradict himself, on the one hand claiming that religious morality is absolute and universal, while on the other hand justifying blatant immoralities by virtue of different moral standards depending on the time, which contradicts the idea of absolute and universal values.
It would have been helpful to say at this point, yes, thousands of years ago, the application of social institutions was a lot different in societies where survival was not a guarantee. In some cases, and Ben brought this up well, I think, if God is trying to encourage people to move towards a progressive understanding of the good, he's trying to move them away from that as bad. He may not give them an ideal set of laws that they're just going to ignore. He may give them progressively better laws to move them to a moral ideal.
Whether he can or whether he can't. If he can't abolish the practice, then the idea of wooing people away from a particular type of sin through a gradualistic process is known throughout societies across human history.
This reasoning makes absolutely no sense, because on the one hand, God does seem capable of giving people an ideal set of laws for them to obey. I'm talking explicit and unequivocal laws like do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not covet your neighbor's goat, and so on. But he needs to be extra careful when ordering against slavery for some reason. And I don't get where this "he may not give them an ideal set of laws that they would just ignore" comes from, because you only seem to apply this reasoning to slavery. It's fine for people to have an ideal set of laws regarding murder and adultery because they won't ignore those, right? How does this work? On the other hand, what progressive set of laws does the Bible offer such that would lure people away from slavery? Because I can give you plenty of quotes that not only lure people towards slavery, but teach masters and slaves how to behave towards one another. Not to mention, Ben's entire lure people away from the practice argument stems from his assumption that God cannot abolish the practice, so he must lure people away as a last resort, without explaining why God simply cannot abolish the practice, like he can do with murder, adultery, witchcraft, and foreskin, for instance. Oh well, I guess it's because his mind is not God's and that's his escape hatch, am I right?
So at the end of the debate, I think Alex was hammering a lot on this and the Bible and religious worldviews, where I think it's important for Ben and others in this position to kind of punch back to say, yeah, but what about non-religious societies? What about what they do in trying to completely, if you're going to talk about one example of religion that leads to something bad, what about other examples of non-religion lead to really horrible evils?
Yeah, but saying my shit is tastier than your shit because it contains sugar isn't really punching back, is it? It's still shit. Whataboutisms do nothing for your argument. On the contrary, I believe they weaken your position because you're essentially saying, I have no counter-arguments against your attack, so I'll red herring out of here instead.
Emotivism is the theory that morality does not refer to objective truths like no one should commit murder. So when we say murder is wrong, that does not refer to the objective truth, no one ought to commit murder, for example. Instead, the statement murder is wrong, what it means is murder makes me feel bad inside. Murder gives me negative emotions. It doesn't refer to an objective state of affairs. It just talks about subjective emotions I have when I think about other behaviors. An atheist who thinks moral statements are just reflections of emotions cannot objectively ground these kinds of moral statements so that they have a universal truth quality about them.
I couldn't agree more with Trent here. I think emotivism is the worst foundation for morality one could have outside of the bare bone because I said so. I think Trent explains why that's the case quite well here. It's not to say empathy doesn't play any role in establishing your moral foundation, but it can be your only pillar. However, I would like to talk about the notions of universal and absolute because Ben mentioned them in his debate and Trent reinstated them here. To put it simply, I don't think you can claim that a given moral value is universal and absolute without demonstrating absolute knowledge, including of the future, obviously. Let's take the example of murder because this is Trent's example too. Claiming that murder is absolutely and universally immoral is basically claiming that it will be immoral for all times until humanity ceases to exist, and I cannot accept that as true. Consider the following futuristic scenario. We actually managed to demonstrate reincarnation and the existence of another universe. In this alternate universe, there is no disease, pain, suffering, death, depression, in short, nothing bad. You only have happiness and joy and eternal life, devoid of boredom and any type of negative emotion or experiences you can think of. And that universe will never die, so you'll live eternally in serenity and happiness. It's pretty much the incarnation of the Christian heaven. Would murder be immoral in that scenario? Because by my standards, I would find it justified to kill every baby at birth to secure them a life free of pain and suffering on the other side. The murder itself would simply be an inconvenient, no longer different than the pain inflicted by a vaccine as means for immunization against a specific virus, but infinitely more rewarding and desirable. And even if you could claim that murder would still be immoral in that scenario, you can't deny that your position would be a lot weaker than it is today, and for good reasons. If you think this example isn't compelling enough, here's a variation you can consider. It is immoral today to prescribe people rat poison as cancer treatment, but you can't claim that this moral statement is absolute and universal because this may not always be the case. Maybe we discover a way to actually incorporate rat poison into the cancer treatment in the future, turning the substance into a beneficial agent. Or maybe people evolve over time so that their physiology now requires rat poison to combat cancer cells. You can imagine any number of such scenarios for any moral value that Ben would consider absolute and universal today. The point is that you cannot proclaim a given moral decree as universal and absolute, so immutable, without also possessing absolute knowledge of the future. The alternative is to have an objective moral system, where objective means unbound by people's subjective perceptions. To come back to murder and utility, the fact that murder is incompatible with a thriving society isn't even a debate. Ben agrees with it, and so does Trent. Consider the following line of reasoning. Generally speaking, people don't want to die. Generally speaking, people are social creatures who want to coexist in peace with others, family, friends, society at large. Murder causes social unrest and suffering and destroys social cohesion. Therefore, murder is objectively immoral. The conclusion is not a matter of opinion. In a system where people don't want to die and want to live in a peaceful and secure society, murder is objectively wrong. So is rape, stealing, and any number of other actions. So, my point is that there are moral facts about the world that we can discover, but that these are objective, not absolute. According to this system, slavery was wrong back then as it is now, just like murder. It doesn't matter how people viewed it. Ben's system doesn't know what to do with slavery because it proclaims moral values as absolute and universal, which means they're not bound by time, but then claims that slavery wasn't moral or immoral as an act itself. It only matters how people of different times view it, which contradicts the notions of absolute and universal. Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to what I already said. Other than that, if you like the content, please consider supporting it any way you seem fit. Even a like can make a massive difference. And it's free. Until next time, peace.